What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, I'm going to answer some of your early pre-season questions, such as, is Son being overlooked? Did the changes to the bonus point system affect how we pick players? And am I worried about players that went deep into the Euro and Copa America tournaments? Plus, there's a bunch of other stuff as well. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button, and let's jump into it. So first question, nice and simple, is Son being overlooked? And I think the answer has to be yes. Of course, there will be people out there, maybe even watching this video with him in their teams, but there's not a huge amount of conversation about him. And I haven't actually checked the ownership of many players, but if I just go and have a look on the FPL page, yeah, let me find him here a second. He's at 8.8% ownership. So players with higher ownership than Son right now, at the time of recording, Rashford, Winks, and Kudus. So he's not that popular. I guess the next question is it fair to overlook him? And I'm a little bit undecided about that. I will say I've put together a few different drafts and Son hasn't been in any of them. And maybe that is a little bit harsh. I mean, first 6 fixtures for Spurs: Leicester away, Everton at home, Newcastle away, Arsenal at home, Brentford at home, Man United away. Now, on paper, you could maybe say that Newcastle, Arsenal, and Man United is a little bit tough. But Man United were poor last year. Son will get chances. I'd see him getting chances at Newcastle. Maybe not quite so many. There is potential there. And the other 3 fixtures are fine, I think. Leicester away, Everton at home, and Brentford at home. So the fixtures are okay. And also, there's probably a perception around Son that he didn't do that well last year. But he's still got 17 goals, 10 assists. He finished on over 200 points for the 3rd time in the last 4 seasons. So there is a player there that we know is fully capable of getting points. He's definitely going to play. He's going to be in that 11 every week under Ange Postecoglou, either as the number 9 or on the left. So there's lots of reasons to consider him. And he's on penalties as well. And to be fair, last year Spurs got hardly any penalties. And in comparison, Chelsea got a lot, which is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons Palmer did so well. That could flip. And all of a sudden, Son looks to be essential. But you can't guarantee that. So I think Son is a solid option. I think 10 million is fair. But if I'm comparing him to like a Saka or a Palmer, I'm not sure Son comes out ahead of either of them. The only thing I could give Son right now is he's got a full pre-season to go before game week 1. Whereas obviously Palmer and Saka are away at the Euros. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But you look at Chelsea's fixtures. Once they get City at home out of the way, in game week 1, it's Wolves away, Palace at home, Bournemouth away, West Ham away, and Brighton at home. And those fixtures are just better than what Spurs have. And I think it's a similar situation for Arsenal. Let me just find an Arsenal player here a second. So their fixtures: Wolves at home, good. Villa away, Brighton at home. Not a bad opening 3 for an attacker. They do play Spurs away then, but there will be goals in that game almost certainly for both sides. And then City away game week 5 is tough. And then you've got Leicester at home, Southampton at home. So I just think the fixtures for both Arsenal and Chelsea for an attacker are slightly better than they are for Spurs. And obviously you're coming off a season where Saka and Palmer have both outscored Son. So unless you're really keen on avoiding players that were in the Euros and you want players that are a bit fresher like Son, I just can't see me going for him. It's not because he's a bad option, but the way that FPL have done the pricing now, there is a decision to make. And I think my decision would probably be to not go for him. But it's not that he's a bad option. So he is being overlooked, possibly rightly so. But also you could look at it another way. Less than 10% ownership for a player that could well go and get over 200 points again. That might be a huge differential game week 1. So just to quickly add something on to the end of that conversation about Palmer, Saka and Son, as part of all the tools over on Fantasy Football Hub, they've got a predicted point section. If you want to check all that out, links in the description as always. Now, I've not checked this before I started recording, but you can do different game week ranges. You can order by price and stuff like that. So I'm going to go to midfielders priced at 10 million or above, which will include Salah, but we can just discount him for a second. So if I go for the first 8 game weeks, so I actually think that Palmer and Saka are probably slightly better if you discount the Euros thing. But Hub have Son at the top. So Salah out in front, as you might imagine, then Son, then Saka, then Palmer. But the difference in points is so minimal, you can almost just go for whoever your preference is. So that's the first 8 game weeks. And if we want to look a little bit shorter term, let's just say the first 6, it's still the same order. Salah, Son, Saka, and then Palmer. So they are genuinely all good options. I just think Son is probably 3rd choice for me right now. But again, there's a long time to go until the game week 1 deadline. I might change my mind on that. So is it essential to own at least one player from Arsenal, Liverpool and Man City? Now the short answer is no. No players are essential, and I think the way that FPL have priced players this year, there's lots of different ways that you can build your squad. That being said, for most people, those three teams are probably going to be the top three in the Premier League this year, and therefore they've got a great shot at clean sheets and of course scoring goals as well. Ultimately, it will come down to minutes and their potential and whether they fit in your budget. You should be looking to get players from these teams, but it doesn't mean that other teams don't have great options as well. Take Man City, for example. We'll just forget Haaland for a second. They have had one of the best defences in the league for multiple seasons now, especially under Pep Guardiola. But half the time, you're not quite sure who's going to play. So you're better off just buying a player from a different team. Now, at the start of this season, that might not be the case. Vardio is back in pre-season training ahead of some of their other defenders. It's very likely that he will start as the first choice left-back for the first few game weeks. Therefore, he's a good option. But he's also 6 million. For the same price, you could go and get an Arsenal defender, possibly Van Dijk or Robertson. You wouldn't just pick Vardio because he plays for Man City and you haven't got any other Man City players. I think people get too caught up with coverage. Obviously, these teams will score lots of goals and therefore you want their attackers. But unless they're going to be on the pitch, it does not matter. Take Liverpool, for example, right? Let's say you've sorted your defence, you've got no room for Trent, Van Dijk or Robertson, and you don't have the budget for Salah. So you're looking at one of their 7.5 million options like Diaz, Jota, Darwin and Gakpo. Unless you know who's going to start, there's no point in just putting one in for the sake of it. You'd probably be better off looking at a Jarrod Bowen or a Gordon instead that you know are going to play every single game, and their minutes will be great as well. So of course, we should be looking at players from these three teams, and I'm sure I'll have a few from each of them, but only if it makes sense. There's not a necessity to have at least one. I think people worry too much about coverage. Ultimately, if you're not on the pitch, you can't get points, and you've got to weigh up whether they're worth it versus another player from a different team. So definitely not essential. Probably quite good to have a few, but definitely not something you have to do. So how much thought do you give to players that went deep into Euro and Copa America tournaments? For example, Saka, Foden and Palmer. Now, right now, while I'm building drafts, I'm probably not giving it a huge amount of thought. And the reason for that is we're going to gain more information over the coming weeks during pre-season. So we know right now how many minutes those players played in those tournaments. What we don't know is how much of pre-season they're going to play, whether they've picked up any knocks, and whether they're ready for game week 1. That is all information we will probably get before that deadline on August 16th. For the players that have been mentioned in the question, for example, Cole Palmer did play for England, was away obviously for the whole tournament at the Euros, but didn't play every game and was used as a substitute, right? So presumably he will be back fresh for Chelsea. And I think I've already seen stuff going around that he's already back doing some kind of training. Maybe not back with a full squad yet, but I'm sure he's going to be ready for game week 1. Someone like Saka, on the other hand, he did have an injury towards the end of the season. For the first couple of games for England, he didn't play the full 90 minutes. That might have just been how the games were going, and that's why he was subbed off. But it could have been that he was building back up to fitness, and he did play a lot of minutes at the tournament. So he might get back a little bit later, and it might not be quite so fresh. And if he's going to miss that Wolves at home game in game week 1, that's one of their best fixtures in the opening 6 game weeks. That might be reason enough to go without him. But while I'm building drafts right now, if I think that Saka is the best option for my team, I'm going to put him in and I'll react to any information we get closer to the time. Because I'd rather try and think about the squad that I want if they're all fit and ready to go. So the fact that Saka and Foden, for example, played a lot of minutes of the tournament won't really worry me unless there's doubts about them starting in game week 1. And if that is the case, I may well go without them. Obviously, there's knock-on effects as well for players that weren't at tournaments. I've already mentioned Vardio. Ake went to the semi-finals in the Euros, which wasn't that much earlier than the finals. It was, Wednesday, and the final was on Sunday. So he could get back late, and sometimes Pep does like to play players that are much fresher, so that could be good for Vardio. But that's all information we'll get over pre-season. I think Copa America is interesting because a lot of the Liverpool attackers went, not just Copa America, I guess Euros as well, with Jota at Portugal, went quite deep into tournaments. So Gakpo went to the semi-finals of the Euros. You've got, let me remember all their names now, Darwin Núñez and Luis Diaz also went deep into Copa America. So there might be issues there. Jota was out with Portugal in the quarterfinals. So it might be that he's the freshest attacker and he gets minutes. So I think it's worth giving it thought, just like it's worth taking into account lots of information, but it wouldn't be dominating my thoughts right now in terms of who I'm going to pick, because I wouldn't be surprised if most of those players that went deep into the tournament, especially if they're key players for their teams, start in game week 1. And if they don't, they'll probably be fine for game week 2 at a minimum. So are premium defenders worth it after they've been nerfed by the bonus points changes? And I think the simple answer is yes, in my opinion at least. I think the impact these changes will have on how we should pick our squads is being wildly overblown. Like, ultimately, you buy premium defenders in the hope they'll get you lots of attacking returns and or lots of clean sheets. And if they do that, the points will come. Unless I've misunderstood it, the only real change is that defenders and goalkeepers will get -4 BPS if they concede a goal. So BPS is the points you accumulate throughout a game for doing different things like shots on target, conceding now, etc. I won't go into all the details. If you want to check it out, it's on the website. And then the players with the highest BPS will get bonus points at the end of the game. So defenders now get -4 if they concede, right? But if I told you right now that Trent Alexander-Arnold is going to score 2 goals in the first 10 game weeks and get a few clean sheets, you'd probably still want him, right? Because the clean sheets are worth points and so are the goals. The biggest change really is that if a team concedes and then a defender goes and gets an attacking return, they're less likely to get bonus points because they've conceded and therefore they're going to lose BPS. But at that point, you really care because you've got an assist or a goal. So it is a little bit of a nerf, but I don't think it's anywhere near enough that we should be changing how we pick our squads. And also remember that the bonus points on offer are 3, 2, and 1. Now, sometimes multiple players can get bonus points, but usually one player gets 3, one gets 2, one gets 1. So let's say in a previous season, Trent gets an assist and Liverpool concede, and he gets 2 bonus points. Well, now he might just get 1 or 0. So it's not like you're suddenly losing 10 points out of nowhere for one single game. Now, I might have misunderstood that. Maybe people have got more of a hang of this than I do. But as far as I understand it, that's about it. When a defender concedes, they are less likely to get bonus if they go and get attacking returns. But you pay the price for the premiums because of those attacking returns and because of the clean sheets. And if they get a clean sheet and attacking return, it's pretty much the same as it was before. So I do think they're worth it. I think usually when you start putting your squads together in pre-season, there's always that eagerness to go for more money in the attack. But as you get closer to game week 1, you start taking a bit of money out, putting those solid premium defenders in. I think I will end up with at least 1, maybe 2 by the time we get to the deadline. So if you disagree with that, let me know in the comments below, because I could have misunderstood, but I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to work. And therefore, if you do pick the right player that's going to get you clean sheets and attacking returns, they're probably still going to be well worth the money. So usually we aim to roll a transfer in game week 2 and immediately after a wild card. Should we be aiming to roll for multiple weeks now instead, given we can have 5 free transfers, or would you still be looking shorter term? Now, if I'm honest, I don't know if I've completely got my head around how much these changes should affect the way we play the game. There's the obvious stuff, of course. In the past, I've been in a position where I've had 2 free transfers, the team looks good, and rather than burn the transfer and waste it, I found a move to make that I didn't really need to do. Whereas now, of course, if that happens this season, you would just roll the transfer instead. So that's obvious. One thing I tweeted about was Ollie Watkins. Now, I don't want to get into a conversation about whether you should have him in game week 1 or not. If you want to do that, you absolutely should. But this is what I said. I possibly, note the word possibly there, want to avoid Watkins in game week 1, but he might be someone I want fairly quick in game weeks 3 or 4. One option would be to set a team for the first couple of game weeks that doesn't need transfers outside of injuries, and then use one of the 2 bank transfers to bring him in. That's what you would have done in previous seasons, right? Because you know in game week 3 you've got 2 transfers and 1 has to be used. So you could set up an aggressive way where you don't start with Watkins because of that Arsenal game in game week 2, but you make sure you got the transfer to bring him in. But now, of course, there's the option to just start with him because you know you're probably going to want him longer term. And if everything goes well and you get to game week 3 and the team looks good and there's no injuries, you just bank a 3rd transfer. Now, it doesn't have to be about Watkins. It can be any player you're thinking about. But there is now that dilemma of, do I play aggressively and try and get a few more points in the short term and then make a transfer? Or do I just go for the longer term better pick and just save the transfer? And I'm not quite sure where I fall on that. I think as with everything in FPL, it's quite difficult to give evergreen advice to say this is what you should do in every situation. it's something that's going to have to be assessed. Like, I don't know, let's use a more extreme example, right? Let's say that Watkins had Man City away, Liverpool away, Arsenal away, first 3 games, and then had Southampton at home, Ipswich at home, Leicester at home. Well, in that case, there's almost certainly another forward that can do better for those first 3 weeks, and then it's probably worth a transfer to bring Watkins in, because he'd then be playing the 3 newly promoted sides. Obviously, it very rarely works out like that in terms of fixtures, but in that case, you would definitely use the transfer. Whereas if the fixtures were a little bit more mixed and you weren't quite sure that the other forward was going to outscore him, in that case, it's probably better to just bank the extra transfer and go with Watkins from the off. And that can apply to midfielders, defenders, whatever you're looking at. So I think when it's a close decision, I'd probably look to maybe roll the transfer more so than I would have done in previous seasons and probably be a little bit less aggressive. Ultimately, the thing that I will leave you with in terms of this answer, the transfer's either worth it or it's not. And I think right now, because we know we can bank 5 free transfers, everyone's sort of thinking like they've got to do that. But that's not the case whatsoever. Think how many times, I've said this before, how many times did you ever get to 2 free transfers banked in your previous seasons playing? Probably not that often. So how much has really changed where you're now going to get to 5? I mean, there's other examples as well, like with a wild card, for example. I think, and I could be wrong, that I used it in game week 10 last year, and some people saved it even longer, like game week 17, game week 20, etc. Now, let's say you get through the first few weeks and you've banked 3, 4, or 5 transfers, but you feel like you need a bit of an overhaul, like 10 players in your squad need to change. It might be even better now to use that wild card earlier, because you can overhaul the whole squad, knowing that straight afterwards you've still got those 3, 4, 5 transfers banked, and you can keep rolling until things, get trickier again. So possibly this change means that an early wild card is worth it, but whether or not it's worth rolling more than it used to be, I guess it probably is slightly, but ultimately the transfer's worth it or not. And I think we're going to have to assess it on a case-by-case basis. For what it's worth, the way that I tend to set up in game week 1 is to not have to make transfers and to not have to use my wild card. And if I need it, I will use it. But if I don't, I will just keep on rolling. So if I get to game week, like when I build my squad in game week 1, it won't be with a transfer probably in game week 3 in mind. So that might actually bring me to the point of having Watkins in from the start if I can afford it. And then just work it out from there. But if I get to game week 3 and need a transfer, I'm going to do it. If I get to game week 4 and I've got to do it again, I will. And if I never have 5 free transfers this season, that might be the best way to play it for my team. So, yeah, maybe there's stuff with this I've missed. I feel like with the bonus points, I'm pretty clear that shouldn't change things too much. Maybe with this, there's a few more things to think about, but I don't think it has a massive impact over those kind of close decisions. And if it's close, I'd rather save a transfer and just get the player in I know I want for the long term, I think. So do you think bench boost in game week 1 and wildcard in game week 2 is viable, given the changes to the game, rolling transfers, and a smaller number of double game weeks? So the first thing I would say, if you're not already, is go and follow Planet FPL. They've got a YouTube channel, they do a podcast as well. They haven't done it at the time recording, but they always do a chip strategy podcast during pre-season, and they will be able to go into much more depth about this than I will. I'm going to answer the question, but I would recommend going to follow them. They do loads of other stuff for FPL as well. Now, because of the changes to the FA Cup, there are going to be fewer double game weeks and smaller ones as well. And in the past, most people would save their bench boost until the second half of the season in the hope that they could get at least a couple, if not a full bench of double game week players. It's less likely that's going to be the case this season. So maybe there is more of a reason to use it in game week 1, and that is becoming more popular. The main reason that people give to not do it is that there is quite a bit of uncertainty at the start of the season. Like right now, I could tell you a lot of players that are definitely going to start in game week 1 if they're fit, but there's always a few surprises. Personally, I don't think that's enough of a reason to not bench boost in game week 1. I think most people, by the time we get to that deadline, will be able to put together a good squad of 15 players with good fixtures that will all start. So that's not really a big issue for me. The thing in the back of my mind is, and look, in previous seasons, even with big double game weeks, I don't think I've ever had a full set of double game week players on my bench boost anyway. But the thing for me is that in game week 1, it's definitely a single game week. And it just feels like it's very likely that at some point during the season, you'll have at least as good a bench as you do in game week 1, if not even better. And if there is a chance later on to have the odd double game weeker on there as well, even better. So I understand why people want to get rid of it straight away, because for some people it really plays on their mind when they're going to use it. But I don't really have that issue. It doesn't bother me if I have to go with 4 single game week players later on. That is just what I'll do. So I probably won't bench boost in game week 1 unless James puts together a really convincing argument for it in that Planet FPL podcast. But I do think it's viable, the bench boost in game week 1. What I dislike more is the wild card in game week 2. Now, I understand it because, again, in previous seasons, a lot of people would wild card in the second half, use their second wild card in the second half of the season to put together a bench boost team. So essentially, you're just doing it the other way around. You're using your unlimited transfers to bench boost, and then you're wild carding out of it. But wild carding in game week 2 just feels so early. I've just said that people will be able to put together a 15-man squad without any issues, but there is still a little bit of uncertainty, and also the transfer window is still open. So you've used your bench boost, you've hoped that's gone well, and then you're wild carding straight away. It just feels like there's too much that could go wrong. And look, I could say players might get injured, but that's also the case if you use the wild card in game weeks 10, 11, 12, etc. Right? So I won't go into that I won't talk about that too much. But game week 2 just still feels way too early. You'd have to absolutely smash it in game week 1 to just make that. I just wouldn't want to use it that early. And also the rolling transfers thing. I don't know if that really comes into this strategy. Like I spoke about it in the last question, that if you've got 4 transfers banked, but you need to make 8 changes, it might be worth just wildcarding instead and having those 4 transfers after the wildcard. That's nice. But by the time you get to game week 2, you've not got any transfers built up apart from 1. Then you're wildcarding anyway, so you wouldn't have another one that would transfer through to game week 3. Basically, on this strategy, bench boost 1, wildcard 2, in game week 3, you would have 1 free transfer, right? Because you don't gain a transfer when you wildcard. You just get to carry through your banked ones. So, yeah, I mean, if the wildcard does really well, you could then maybe roll in 3, 4, 5, 6 and start building them up. But that's not a guarantee. So, I don't know. Like I said, James and Suze will go into much more depth about this on Planet FPL. And I've already heard James mention this on other podcasts, that maybe it is going to be viable. And I don't mind bench boost in game week 1 if people just want to get rid of it. And also, there's no harm in having a good bench for a few weeks, by the way. That can actually be super handy. I just don't like pre-planning a wildcard in game week 2. For me, that just feels too early. And the rolling transfers thing doesn't really change that for me. Are there any Man United players worth going near, or is it a case of wait and see? Now, the smart strategy is probably just to wait and see what happens. There's no one in that squad that I look at, especially with the prices that FPL have given them, where I think they've absolutely got to be in my game week 1 squad. There is definitely potential there if Man United can improve, because the prices are kind, but I don't think you need to go out of your way to include them in game week 1. Like if you look at the defence, for example, the non-attacking defenders are 4.5 and the likes of Dallow and Shaw are 5 million. There is potential there if they can get their act together. But we saw how bad the defence was last year. And so far, you've got 2 main signings, Xerxes, who's an attacker, and Yoro, who, look, I don't know much about him. Right? I've only heard about him recently. Everyone seems really excited about him. He could be great in the future, but he's 18 years old. The chance of him coming in and completely revolutionising that defence straight away is not that likely. And also, it's not just your defenders that have an impact on how many shots and stuff you concede, right? It's also how well you press, how many ball winners you've got in midfield, and not much has changed in that regard. So I don't think there's a need to rush out. And also, the fixtures just aren't that great. Like between game weeks 1 and 7, there's only one good home game, and that's probably Fulham at home game week 1. And no one would, it wouldn't be a complete surprise if Fulham score in that game. Then it's Brighton away, Liverpool at home. Even Southampton is away. Possible clean sheet there. Palace away, Spurs at home, Villa away. So defensively, I just don't see it. Longer term, possibly, but I'd really want to see some improvement. I think if you're going for a Man United player straight away, it's probably an attacker. Like Bruno Fernandes is just fine at 8.5. I think he's better than Odegaard for the same price. I think the fixtures are okay for an attacker, and he's on penalties as well. Whereas Odegaard only gets them when Saka lets him take one. And Fernandes is quite consistent as well. So I don't mind Fernandes, but I don't know. When I've been building squads, I've never really had room for an 8.5. I'm almost always downgrading that spot to try and spend money elsewhere, or finding money to go for like a Foden or a Palmer or a Saka instead. So I think Fernandes is fine. You know what you're getting, nailed on minutes, penalties, etc. It doesn't feel that exciting for game week 1. Garnacho is probably the one at 6.5. Given how well he played last year, and he basically became first choice winger, you would expect him to start the season if he's fit. I have got hopes for Rashford. I think, new coaches come in, Van Nistelrooy, they have made some good signings so far. Like Yoro obviously was wanted by Real Madrid. I suspect the reason he came to Man United was money in the end. But either way, that is a big signing. So there is a bit more of a buzz around Man United, new ownership, etc. So I've got hopes for Rashford, but I think based on last season, Garnacho was the more consistent player, and I would hope that he will start the season. Probably with Rashford on the other side. I'm not sure who's going to line up on the left. We'll have to wait and see. Probably Rashford and Garnacho on the right. But pre-season will give us an idea of that. But for 6.5, I think Garnacho stands up pretty well to the other options around that price. So if I was going for a Man United player, it'd probably be him. I think with Højlund, he will probably start the season, but Xerxes there as well. We need to see how he fits in. Garnacho is the one. If you look at other midfielders at that price point, so I just bring them up here and go to selected by price. Leon Bailey at Villa could be good. Mitoma, if he's fit throughout pre-season, could be decent. You've got Nkunku, I've spoke about a lot already. Possibly Szoboszlai, McAllister, depending on kind of what position they play. Doku, Grealish, 6.5 as well. But I think Garnacho, if he's going to get the minutes, probably stands up pretty well against all of those players. His stats were good last year as well. He's still young. There's going to be a bit of improvement there. I really like him. Like Gibbs White is another player that comes out quite a lot. Good first 3 fixtures. Good asset if he's on penalties. Brennan Johnson's another player I quite like too if he's going to get the minutes. But I quite like Garnacho. And honestly, and there's a bit of bias here for me because I'm a Man United fan. If I was starting with a 6.5 million midfielder, it might be Garnacho. And he's probably the one worth going there. I don't mind Fernandes either, but that's really the only two. I think for Man United defence, you're expecting such a big improvement, but also you need those fixtures from kind of game week 8 onwards. At that point, there's loads of stuff that could have happened, and they might not be worth going there. So for me, Garnacho, possibly Fernandes, probably no one else right now. I want Rashford to do well, but I think it's hard to say that he's worth the extra 0.5 over Garnacho. So unless you think he's going to have another 17-goal season, you might as well just save your money. So what are your thoughts about going for Konaté, as he's 2 million cheaper than Trent Alexander-Arnold? I think at some point this season, there is definitely going to be value to be had in that Liverpool defence. I'm just not sure I want to bet on it straight away under a new manager. Like last year, Quansah played quite a lot, and it could be that he is first choice under Arnie's slot instead. And I think he's actually even cheaper, right? If we just go to Liverpool a second, where's Quansah? He's 4.5 million and Konaté's 5. So one of those two could be good value, but not if there's going to be a bit of rotation. Also, Konaté worries me a little bit in terms of how prone he is to picking up injuries and stuff like that. So realistically, if I'm answering right now, and pre-season might give us something different to think about, I think you've got to go for Trent, Robertson or Van Dijk and just probably ignore that second centre-back. Like, if it gets to pre-season, Konaté's injured and Quansah's going to start, then 4.5 million, he'll be in everyone's team. Or vice versa, right? If Quansah's injured and Konaté's going to be there, then 5 million could be an option. But I'm just a little bit worried about the injuries he picks up. And also rotation is the thing. I think with Liverpool, you kind of got to spend the money to get that quality option. But I got no doubts at some point this season, it might be game week 1, depending on what happens in pre-season, that we will be looking at those cheaper Liverpool defenders, and they could be great value. So I'm actually going to leave that one there. I'm never too sure how popular Q&A videos will be during pre-season. So if you did enjoy that one or you want to see more, make sure to give the video a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to get your team rated for free and see how it looks with Konaté or Trent or Van Dijk, you can do that over on Fantasy Football Hub using the links in the description below. Otherwise, I will catch you tomorrow for another video.